A man walks into a room in Jerusalem and lays a bag of money at the apostles' feet. Everyone there sees a gift. Nobody sees a number. Within the hour he is dead. And the man who wrote this down never says God struck him. That silence is deliberate. 7 chapters later, the same writer describes another sudden death, in the same book, and there he names the killer in a single line. Here he names no one. Not for the husband, not for the wife, 3 hours later, on the same floor. Hold that. Before we finish, we are going to count it. Almost everyone receives this story the same way. 2 people lied about money. God killed them where they stood. The moral: be careful what you promise the church. And that moral has done something strange to the passage. It has made Acts chapter 5 the chapter nobody preaches. Stewardship season skips it. The giving sermon skips it. It sits in the middle of the most hopeful stretch in the New Testament like a stone in a shoe. So let us say the discomfort out loud, instead of managing it. Acts has just spent 4 chapters describing an outbreak of generosity. Thousands of people, shared meals, shared property, nobody going without. And then, at the exact moment the thing is working, 2 of its members fall dead over the price of a field, in the age of grace, over money. The passage owes an answer to that. Most teaching on it never arrives, because most teaching stops at the first thing that looks like one. The first thing that looks like an answer is a verb. We reach it in about 4 minutes. It is not where this ends. Start with the room, because the room explains the money. Jerusalem, a few years after the crucifixion. The movement is weeks old, and growing faster than anyone planned for. And the common purse that gets quoted so warmly existed for a reason nobody mentions: logistics. Pentecost had filled that city with pilgrims from a dozen countries, and a great many of them never went home. They had travel money and no work. A man from Cyprus has no trade in Jerusalem, no landlord in Jerusalem, no field in Jerusalem. The people who owned land were the people who already lived there. So Luke describes the arrangement in chapter 4, and he keeps it physical. Owners of land and houses sold them, brought the price, and laid it down at the apostles' feet. The apostles handed it back out, to each person according to need. Stay on that phrase. Laid it down at the feet. Luke uses it 3 times in 11 verses, and he does not mean it as a figure of speech. He means a floor. Nobody slides a bank transfer under a door. A man walks across that floor, in daylight, past neighbors who know his name, and sets a bag down where the whole room can watch it land. Luke even hands us one to hold. A Levite from Cyprus named Joseph, whom the apostles had renamed Barnabas, son of encouragement. He had land. He sold it. He brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. That is the last verse of chapter 4. The first verse of chapter 5. But a certain man named Ananias, with Sapphira his wife, sold a possession. One word, but. Luke has set a man beside a man. Same act, same room, same floor. One of them gets remembered for 2,000 years, and it is not the one who gave everything. Now hold one more thing, because we need it in about 10 minutes, and it is the piece that changes the temperature of this entire story. The Jerusalem church was not the only Jewish community in that country living out of a shared purse. A day's walk east of the city, on the dry shelf above the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, another community had organized itself the same way. And unlike the church, they wrote their rules down. In 1947, those rules came out of a cave above that site. Scholars call the document the Community Rule. One line in it is about lying and money, and we are coming back to it. First, the verb. Acts 5, verse 2. Ananias sold the possession and kept back part of the price. In English, kept back sounds like nothing. It sounds like prudence. It sounds like a man setting something aside for old age. And hold that thought, because Peter is about to say something startling about exactly that. The Greek underneath is a different animal. It is not neutral, and it is not the ordinary word for keeping. The word is nosphizomai, and it is the word an auditor uses. It means to skim, to siphon, to move a portion quietly sideways into your own pocket, while the ledger says otherwise. Picture a hand closing over 3 coins on the way to the table. The word is rare. It appears 3 times in the entire New Testament, and 2 of them sit right here, in verse 2 and verse 3. The only other place is a letter to Titus, where Paul tells household servants not to do it. Do not pilfer. Do not shave a little off the grocery money on the walk home from the market. So Luke reaches past the ordinary word for keeping and picks the accountant's word for stealing. And here is the part that has made this passage briefly famous online. I want to put it on the table now instead of saving it for the finish, because it is not the destination. It is the doorway. That same verb turns up in the Greek Old Testament, the translation Greek-speaking Jews were reading in the 1st century. It sits at Joshua chapter 7, verse 1. And Joshua 7 is the story of Achan. Israel has just crossed the Jordan. Jericho has just fallen. First city, first victory. And the spoils of that city had been set apart. The Greek word there is anathema. At that point, it does not mean a curse. It means a pile with somebody else's name already on it. Achan walked past that pile and took 3 things: a Babylonian robe, 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold weighing 50 shekels. Then he dug a hole in the dirt floor of his tent, laid the silver in the bottom of it, packed the earth back down, and slept on top of it. The next battle was a small one, against a town called Ai. Israel lost. 36 men did not come home. That was the price of what was lying under one tent floor, and not one of those 36 men knew it was there. Here is a brand new community, freshly arrived in the land it had been promised, and the first sin recorded inside it is a man keeping back part of what had already been handed over. That is the connection. One rare verb, one deliberate echo. And Luke is telling his reader that the church has a Joshua 7 of its own. The link is real. Anyone with a concordance can check it in 4 minutes, and I would rather hand it over early than dress it up as a discovery. It is also, by now, the standard answer. Search this passage online, and it comes back on the first page. And it does not answer the question. Because if Luke is retelling Achan, the retelling breaks in a place almost nobody mentions. In Joshua 7, God speaks. God names the crime. God names the procedure. God pronounces the sentence out loud, in advance, before anything happens to anybody. In Acts 5, God says nothing, not one word. There is no verdict anywhere on the page. There is a man asking questions. Now the scroll. The community rule came out of the first cave at Qumran, and it is not a theological essay. It is a handbook. It reads like the bylaws of an organization, written by people who had to run one, and that is exactly what makes it useful here. Column 6, lines 18 to 20, describes what happened when a man was admitted. He handed his property and his earnings to the community's bursar, the man who kept the books, and the bursar wrote the amount down in a ledger beside his name. Not poured into a pot and stirred. Written down. His name and his number existed in somebody else's handwriting, on a page he did not control. And then column 6, lines 24 and 25, names an offense. If one of them has lied deliberately in matters of property, that is the phrase, in that order, he shall be excluded from the pure meal of the congregation for 1 year, and shall do penance with respect to 1/4 of his food. Sit inside that for a moment. In 1st century Judea, in a Jewish religious community that pooled its money, lying about property was common enough to need a written statute. It had a name, a hearing, and a fixed penalty. Somebody had worked out the going rate in advance. And the going rate was not death. It was a year of eating alone, and a smaller plate. Now an honest note, because honesty is worth more than a tidy parallel. The Qumran community was not the church. Nobody knows whether Ananias had ever heard of that rulebook, and no evidence says he had. Hold it loosely, because the point does not depend on it. Here is what the scroll does establish, and this part is solid. If a man in that country, in that century, held back part of a property settlement from his religious community, a known and survivable consequence waited for him, and the people around him knew what it was. A year of embarrassment, less food, then back in. A year is a long time to eat by yourself, and it is also a year you survive. So the death in Acts 5 is not a fine from anybody's schedule of penalties, and nobody in that room is reading from one. If this passage were the punishment for lying about money, it is the harshest sentence in the New Testament by an enormous margin, handed down without a trial by an apostle who did not know it was coming. And now listen to what Peter actually says, because it runs opposite to everything this passage is famous for. Whiles it remained, was it not thine own? And after it was sold, was it not in thine own power? Acts 5, verse 4. 18 words, and they take the standard reading apart. The land was his, the money was his. Peter says so out loud, to the man's face, in the middle of confronting him. Nobody had required the sale. Nobody had set a percentage. There was no minimum, and there was no list. The apostle's opening move is to hand a man his own property back in the form of a question. So the crime was not withholding. Peter has just finished saying that withholding was allowed. Hold both pieces in one hand. An offense whose known penalty was not death, and an apostle stating plainly that the man could keep every coin. Which means Luke is not writing about a man's finances. He is writing about something a man did with a number, in a room, in front of people. Now count the silence. One more rare word sits in this passage, and nobody teaches it, because in English, it disappears completely. Verse 5. Ananias, hearing these words, fell down and gave up the ghost. That last phrase is a single Greek verb, exiko, 2 pieces, out and to grow cold. The breath goes out and the body cools. It is not a gentle word. When Stephen dies 2 chapters later, Luke says he fell asleep. This is not that word. Exiko appears 3 times in the New Testament. All 3 sit in the book of Acts. One man wrote all 3. The first is Ananias, chapter 5, verse 5. The second is Sapphira, verse 10. The third is chapter 12, verse 23. Here is that third one in full. And immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory. And he was eaten of worms, and gave up the ghost. Watch what Luke does there. He names the agent, the angel of the Lord. He names the action, smote. He names the reason, because he gave not God the glory. Agent, blow, motive, in one sentence. And then that same rare word for dying. Now go back 7 chapters. Ananias, hearing these words, fell down, and gave up the ghost. No agent, no blow, no reason. A man hears a sentence and goes down. Verse 10. The wife. Then fell she down straightway at his feet, and yielded up the ghost. Luke even reuses straightway, the same adverb he attaches to Herod. Same adverb, same rare verb, and in Herod's case, a named angel doing a named thing. Here, nothing. The same author describes another death exactly like it, and the sentence simply stops at the place where the explanation should sit. And he is not squeamish about judgment scenes. 8 chapters later he writes one at full volume. Paul stands in front of a sorcerer named Elymas, and says it out loud, And now, behold, the hand of the Lord is upon thee, and thou shalt be blind, not seeing the sun for a season. Sentence pronounced, in public, by an apostle, before it lands. Peter never does that. Listen to what he says to Ananias, and count the question marks. Why hath Satan filled thine heart to lie to the Holy Ghost? Question. Whiles it remained, was it not thine own? Question. After it was sold, was it not in thine own power? Question. Why hast thou conceived this thing in thine heart? Question. 4 questions. Then 1 statement, and the statement is not a verdict. Thou hast not lied unto men, but unto God. He does not sentence him. He diagnoses him. There is a difference between those 2 things, and the whole chapter turns on it. And then a man falls down. So here is the whole chapter in 9 words. The text says, he fell. It never says he was struck. Now let me be honest about what that does and does not prove, because this is the exact point where it would be easy to sell more than I have. It does not prove God had nothing to do with it. Careful readers have gone the other way for centuries, and their argument is a real one. Luke chose one rare word for dying. He used it 3 times. One of those 3 is unmistakably an act of God. Same verb, same author, same book. That reading is old, serious, and defensible, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Scholars are divided here, and honest people land on both sides of it. What Luke's silence rules out is narrower and far more useful. It rules out the version most of us were handed. The chapter as a schedule of penalties, where the offering gets weighed, the shortfall gets calculated, and the punishment gets issued to match. That version needs a verdict. There is no verdict on the page. Luke owned the vocabulary for one. He used it 7 chapters later. He declined to use it here. A second silence deserves a mention, and a complication in the same breath. Verse 11 says, "And great fear came upon all the church." In the oldest manuscripts, that is the first time the word ecclesia, church, appears in the book of Acts. But the King James follows a later family of manuscripts, and that family carries the word back in chapter 2. So this one is not clean. Treat it as a footnote, not a foundation. And there is a third silence. This one is the hardest. 3 hours pass between the 2 deaths. Verse 7. "And it was about the space of 3 hours after, when his wife, not knowing what was done, came in." Not knowing. Her husband has been carried out of that room, wrapped, and buried, and in 3 hours, nobody sent word to his wife. Luke reports it. He does not explain it. He does not tell us what she was thinking as she came through that door. He tells us one thing only. She did not know. Why nobody told her, the text will not say. Anything anyone says about that gap is a guess, mine included, and I am not filling it in for the sake of a smoother story. What the text does record is where the young men were standing while Peter spoke to her, because he tells her himself, "Behold, the feet of them which have buried thy husband are at the door." And he changes the charge. To the husband, it was lying. To her, "How is it that ye have agreed together to tempt the Spirit of the Lord?" The Greek word is peirazo. It means to test a thing to find out whether it will hold, the way a man leans his weight onto a plank, slowly, before he trusts it with the second foot. Agreed together. 2 people, 1 number, worked out in advance at their own table, then carried into a room to see whether it would hold. Which brings us to the only accusation in the entire passage. Not thou hast stolen, not thou hast withheld. Peter says, "Thou hast not lied unto men, but unto God." Lied. And notice how the lie got told. Luke never records Ananias saying a single word. The man gets no dialogue in the whole story. Nobody spoke this lie. Somebody performed it. He carried a partial amount across a floor and set it down in a posture that said, "This is all of it." Barnabas had walked that same floor a few verses earlier. That is what Ananias was reaching for. Not the money he kept. Peter has already told him he could keep it. What he wanted was the look on the room's face when Barnabas set his bag down. He was not buying security with the part he held back. He was buying a reputation with the part he handed over. And that is where this stops being an ancient story about a real estate transaction. You have almost certainly never lied to an apostle about a field. But you may know the smaller version by heart. The same posture, in a room where people could see you. It is the envelope you filled out at the table instead of at home, and the half-second of hesitation before you wrote the number, because the person beside you was writing at the same time. It is the year your giving went down, and how you began folding the envelope over twice so the shape of it would not say anything about you. It is the moment somebody at church asked what you had been able to do this year, and you heard your own voice rounded up. Not by much, just enough. It is the number you have never said out loud to anyone. Not to your children, not to the person you have been married to for 40 years, not in a prayer. And for some of you it is simpler and heavier than all of that. You stopped putting anything in at all, because giving less, in front of people who remember what you used to be able to give, felt worse than giving nothing. You are not going to fall down on a floor over that. That is not what this chapter is for, and anyone who uses it that way is using it against the plain sense of the text. Because listen again to how Peter opens. His first two sentences to a man he is confronting are not accusations at all. They are property law. Whiles it remained, was it not thine own? And after it was sold, was it not in thine own power? Nobody asked Ananias for the money. Nobody asked him for all of it. Nobody set a percentage, published a minimum, or kept a list. The apostle's opening move is to give a man his own possessions back and remind him they were never being counted. That is still the opening move, and it is still addressed to you. Whatever you gave this year, whatever you did not give, whatever you used to be able to give and cannot give now, nobody in that room was ever asking you for the number. Not then, not now. Your number was never the thing on the scale. You are not Ananias for keeping something back. Peter says in plain words that keeping something back was permitted. And he says it to the man's face while the man is standing in front of him. One thing went wrong on that floor, and one thing only. A man performed a total he had not reached. And notice what that does to the room. You can carry a small amount across that floor, and it is not a small thing you are carrying. The widow with 2 coins in her hand is not doing a reduced version of what Barnabas did. She is doing the same thing he did, all the way down, with what she has. So if you have ever felt a quiet dread reading this chapter, if some part of you has wondered whether your giving is being audited somewhere, and whether your shortfall is being written down against your name, hear this clearly. That dread did not come out of the text. The text goes out of its way not to say it. Somebody added a verdict that Luke refused to write, and then handed it to you as a warning. You are allowed to put that down. You were never carrying it for him. Go back to the room one more time. A man walks across a floor and sets a bag down at the apostle's feet, in front of everyone he knows. That is the picture this chapter opens with, and it never really leaves it. That floor was never a courtroom. It was a place where people set things down and walked out lighter than they came in. The text says he fell. It never says he was struck. Nobody there was counting. Set it down.